Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's appropriate that I rise in the House today with great disappointment to debate Bill S-7, which is offensively called a Zero Tolerance for Barbaric Cultural Practices Act. Yesterday, the government members of this House had the opportunity to vote to create a national action plan to end violence against women, and all but one chose to vote against a plan that would genuinely work to end violence against women. Instead, here we are faced with this bill, Bill S-7, which will likely pass and will likely inflict more violence on women. I would like to state for the record that the crimes this government would see as, quote, barbaric cultural practices are found in all cultural groups and among all communities. Gender-based violence includes what the Conservatives like to call, quote, honor killings, forced marriages, and polygamy. And all of these can be found in white Christian homes that have been in Canada since Confederation. What does serve to make immigrant and refugee women more vulnerable in Canada is a culture that marginalizes them, a society that racializes and stereotypes them, and a political climate that places systemic barriers between them and their ability to claim their rights to which they are entitled. S-7 works to fan the flames of the Islamophobic and racist stigma that immigrant women face. It names problems that all women face as, quote, cultural, and then, in practice, it clamps down on immigration policy that is already discriminating against refugees and immigrants from South Asian, Arab, and African states. I, alongside my feminist colleagues from all regions, are sick and tired of having to battle against xenophobic, misogynistic legislation that masquerades as feminism in Parliament. Alia Hogben, the Executive Director of the Canadian Council of Muslim Women, came to testify at the Status of Women Committee this year when we were studying violence against women. There she said, quote, "It is dehumanizing and degrading to label certain forms of violence as barbaric when all of it is so. Why are some politicians labeling some practices as barbaric and linking it with immigrants only? Polygamy, femicide, and forced marriages are all present in Canadian society, with one significant example of the Mormon community of Bountiful, which has been practicing all of these since the 1950s. Why the blame and targeting of immigrants or visible minority groups?" End of quote. Throughout my mandate as the critic for the Status of Women, I worked closely with a brilliant lawyer and advocate for the South Asian Legal Clinic of Ontario. Deepa Matu has taken it upon herself to do some of the most extensive research on early and forced marriage that we have in Canada. As such, she is an expert on the crimes that this bill claims to address. She stands in fervent opposition to it, as do the vast majority of the advocates, lawyers, and community representatives who actually work with the victims of gender-based violence. This is what Deepa Matu had to say about S-7's offensive short title. Quote, "Giving it a shock factor name will not eliminate the issue. Instead, it will force perpetrators to take this underground, ensuring the victims and potential victims are isolated from any resources. This causes a greater risk to their safety, not to mention their emotional and mental well-being." End of quote. At its core, S-7 is creating dangerous conditions for women who may indeed be in a vulnerable situation. However, instead of empowering these women and girls with the culturally appropriate education, tools, and services they need to claim their rights, S-7 would see them deported or denied entry into Canada. What is incredibly threatening about the language of this bill is that it says that Canada can deny entry or deport people if they are, quote, "have practiced, are practicing, or may in future practice polygamy." This provision, Mr. Speaker, is problematic on every level. How can anyone deny immigration status to someone based on the suspicion that they will practice polygamy in the future? How can we start criminalizing individuals based on crimes we fear they might commit in the future? And last I checked, the Minister of Immigration is not empowered with telepathic powers. This government has already passed legislation that gives tremendous powers to the Minister of Immigration, so that transparency in the immigration and refugee system in our country barely exists at all anymore. The NDP has repeatedly pointed out that making an individual's refugee status entirely contingent upon the discretion of the minister contravenes international human rights conventions. The government is now writing immigration law that will be adjudicated only by the discretion of the minister and that allows us to discriminate based on the suspicion of future crimes or the marriage practices of one's relatives or the practices of the community they come from. Dr. Hanana Siddiqui from South All Black Sisters in the UK said, quote, "The thing is, deportation has always been a problem. It's not just for the men, it's for the women and the children. It doesn't resolve the problem of polygamy itself. It just creates discrimination, alienation, and mistrust within minority communities. I think you have to look at other ways of trying to solve the problem." End quote. Mr. Speaker, the question here is, when will this government understand? Deportation is never a solution to violence against women. When immigrant and refugee women are facing gender-based violence, the threat of deportation for themselves, their children, or their family will work to keep them in a violent domestic situation. I'd like to end my speech by talking in positive terms about what this government can do right now to substantially address violence against women. First, they can listen to women themselves who have been the victims of violence. This bill, Bill S-7, along with almost all the legislation the government passes under the auspices of saving women, is paternalistic and does not benefit anything close to adequate, is not any form of adequate consultation in terms of the communities it affects. Second, they can listen to the experts, advocates, and service providers who are telling them that this bill is a terrible way to address violence against women and will likely create more violence in women's lives. Third, they can take up the content of my motion, M444, that was in front of us yesterday, to create with all due haste a national action plan to end violence against women. This national action plan is, by the way, what the advocates, experts, and service providers are asking for. This is what women themselves are asking for. Fourth, and finally, they can make substantive immigration reform that would ensure that women are never subject to deportation, detention, or removal if they are the victims of violence or fear violence. We must work to keep families together. We must inform women of their rights. We must create culturally appropriate services and shelters. We must end the threat of random, unfounded deportations, and we must work as a society and as a government to counteract racism and stigma. This is what we can do. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires? La députée de Jeanne Labert.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I thank my colleague for a very eloquent and very powerful sharing of thoughts. We hear the title, and we're told by this government that it doesn't mean anything. It's not separating anybody. But I mean, if you think about it, we use the terms cultural diversity. We use the terms cultural communities. And we're using the term cultural barbaric practice. People hear the term cultural, and there is an instinctive walk towards certain communities. Now, I would ask my honourable colleague if she would care to comment on whether or not she feels this actually opens the door on an immigration level to a certain type of profiling, cultural profiling, if you will. And I'd ask my colleague to comment on that.
Honourable Member for Churchill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to my colleague for raising the kind of language, the explosive language that this government is using in the case of this bill, and that we see often in the legislation that they put forward. What is clear, and we heard this from witness after witness, we heard it in the Status of Women Committee as well, where we were looking at violence against women, is that language matters. And in this case, the connection was often made between the kind of language we've seen from this government on Bill S-7, but also in terms of other legislation as well, that seeks to fan the flames of racism and Islamophobia in our country. Mr. Speaker, it's no accident that those kinds of connections are made by this government. It's not just in terms of S-7. We've heard it from pronouncements from members of this government in various forms. And the reality is that not only here are we connecting it to a situation that, as I said, stands to create more violence in women's lives, but they're using this as an excuse to hack away at our immigration system, to make it less transparent, to leave more power to the minister, and ultimately to change the face of Canada as they see fit. Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to stand with my colleagues in the NDP against S-7 and against the kind of regressive and frankly misogynistic legislation that this government puts forward time and time again.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for London Fanshawe.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for her comments because they are so significant in regard to what we heard in the Committee for Citizenship and Immigration. Now, it's interesting, I was a member of that committee, and I heard testimony from the Canadian Bar Association, and they advised this government to simply scrap S-7 because it did far more harm than good. It jeopardizes the victims of violence, potentially marginalizes them from their families if they come forward. It criminalizes people, Mr. Speaker, and it makes women and children open to deportation. What on earth happens to these women and children who are deported because they're in a polygamous situation? They go back to a country where they have no one and nothing. And when I asked the minister on Tuesday about the recommendation from the Canadian Bar Association, his response was simply to dismiss them. And he said that they were just a bunch of card-carrying liberals, and it didn't matter what they had to say. And I wonder what my colleague has to say in regard to the dismissing of the concerns of the Canadian Bar Association.
Member for Churchill.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to my colleague. I know my colleague has, as a previous former critic on the status of women and an incredible feminist member of Parliament, is someone that is outspoken on the issues that matter to women in Canada. And I mean, you know, it's absolutely ludicrous to hear the government not just dismiss, but offend, turn around and offend a respected body like the Canadian Bar Association that came out with a very strong recommendation against this bill. But Mr. Speaker, unfortunately, this shocks few of us anymore. The kind of interactions, the kind of attitude we see daily at committee vis-a-vis witnesses that don't agree with this government leads to all sorts of despicable behavior, I would say. And Mr. Speaker, as I said in my speech, it's so important for the government to listen to the witnesses that know most about this issue. So moving away from their ideological agenda and actually hear from advocates, from community organizations that see this issue up close and personal every day. And I think of the work of Deepa Matu, who has moved heaven and earth to be able to come up with research on the issues of forced marriage here in Canada and around the world, a woman who deeply cares about these issues and who came out and said, say no to Bill S-7. It's a bill that reeks of racism and discrimination, and let's stand up to build a better Canada. I'm proud to be part of a team that does that.